Hello, Ted Shoebat here, giving you guys another message that the church is not telling you. Today, we're going to be talking about the sword of St. Peter, and also this gives me a great opportunity to provide you guys a most thorough book review of a book that I just got done last night. It's called On Consideration by St. Bernard of Clairvaux. St. Bernard of Clairvaux was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of the medieval church fathers, and he also mastered the concept of Christian spirituality in the Middle Ages. The idea of connecting with God, discovering who God is, understanding God, and having what he calls really a state of mind where you are just plunged into complete happiness and bliss. Some people call it Christian mysticism, other people call it Christian contemplation, or simply medieval spirituality. Very fascinating. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about. There's one concept that St. Bernard really comprehended and explained very well, and that was the concept of the sword of St. Peter. The fact that Peter had a sword, he had a sheath in which there was a sword. And in Luke chapter 22, when Jesus said, those who do not own a sword, sell your purse and buy one. Peter tells Jesus, "Here, Lord, I have two swords." Well, what does this mean? And this is the question that a lot of commentators, even to this day, are boggled by. What is the significance behind these two swords? And some people take a very literal interpretation of this and say, well, he simply had two swords, and the gospel is merely recording this fact. But when that's if you look at it through a strictly secular point of view, which sadly many Bible commentators today do. But if you look at the Bible through a purely spiritual view and through a theological lens and with the belief of divine destiny and divine providence, then you would conclude that there is definitely a significance, and that Peter is not saying this in vain. And the gospel writer, Luke, is not writing this simply just to write it. He's writing this through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, which means that there is a purpose for it. So what is the significance behind the two swords? And St. Bernard concludes in this book, On Consideration, that one sword represents the temporal authority of the church, and the other sword represents the spiritual authority. So therefore, when St. Peter in Acts chapter 15 gets up in the Council of Jerusalem and he says that circumcision will not be obligatory, and he makes that final decision, that was Peter exercising the spiritual sword. And you can also say that when St. Paul says to take up the sword of the Spirit, he talks about the full armor and all of the equipment of the soldier of God, and he uses militaristic analogies. When St. Paul says to use the sword of the Spirit, that was most definitely the spiritual sword of the church. And then you have the temporal sword. So this is where it gets a little bit sensitive. But Jesus tells Peter to put the sword back into your sheath, because when they come to arrest Jesus, Peter pulls out the sword, whacks this guy's ear off. Jesus says, Put your sword back into your sheath, Peter. And he gives his reason for telling Peter this. Many people misinterpret this verse to be really an exhortation toward pacifism, but this is simply not the truth, because Jesus subsequently states, "For this cup this cup I am to pass." And he uses the analogy of the cup, which of course is talking about the chalice with the wine, that is significant of his suffering. So what he's telling Peter is, I am here on this earth to die on the cross. You are hindering this. You cannot hinder this. So simply put, Peter uses the sword inappropriately. He uses the sword not in the correct situation, not in an adequate situation. So he tells Peter to put his sword back into his sheath. Well, that doesn't mean be pacifist. That simply means you use the sword in the wrong way. So because Peter puts his sword back into his sheath, that means that the church still has the sword. The sword was never thrown away, because Peter never threw away the sword. So therefore, when is it correct for the church to exercise the use of the sword physically and not just spiritually. So St. Bernard deals with this. I'm just going to read to you guys a number of excerpts. He says, yet if one should deny that you have the sword. Now, to give you a bit of context here, St. Bernard is writing this to a specific individual. He's not writing this to a general audience. He is writing this book to instill instruction into the current pope of his day, and that was Pope Eugenius. And so he's telling Pope Eugenius when is it okay to exercise the sword, and in what particular circumstances. And so St. Bernard says, yet if anyone should deny that you have the sword, he does not seem to me to have paid sufficient attention to his Lord's words. Quote, put back thy sword into the sheath. To you, then, the sword belongs, and it should be unsheathed. It may be with your consent, though not by your hand. Otherwise, if it no way belonged to you, then the apostle said, lo, here are two swords. The Lord would not have replied, it is enough. He would have said, you are too many. They are too many swords. Both swords belong to the church, the spiritual and the material. The one is to be used to defend the church, and the other must even be banished from the church. The one is wielded by the priest, the other by the soldier, and of course with your consent and at the command of the emperor. More of this elsewhere. Now, however, seize the sword which was entrusted to you, that you might strike, wound, for the saving of their souls, if not all, if not many even, at all events, as many as you can. So what he's saying is that, of course, you can utilize the sword, but only with the use of a official military. So the church cannot go around killing people. The church has to have first consent by the government, and the church has to have influence of the government. So this is why in the Middle Ages there was this beautiful harmony between church and state. It wasn't completely severed as we have in American culture and other Western societies. There was a harmony between the church and the state, in that the church influenced the state to execute religious endeavors that would otherwise be unable to be used by the church. So, for example, the Crusades is one of the best examples of this, one of the best illustrations of this, because you had a situation in which the Muslims were persecuting the church. They were trying to destroy the church, and then you had Pope Urban II, who said we need to use the sword against the Muslims. So he pleaded with the governments of Europe, and many governments conceded, and many soldiers went and fought against the Muslims. Well, this was the Pope utilizing the temporal sword. And again, the temporal sword must only be used when you have an enemy that is trying to destroy the church, has to pertain to the church, and you have a government or you have an official army that is willing to fight for the cause of Christendom. So that is the Sword of St. Peter, and here is the book, St. Bernard on Consideration. I will definitely recommend it for those of you who want to get deep spiritually, and who want to have a grasp of medieval spirituality, understanding God, comprehending God, knowing what is God, and also understanding the temporal authority of the church, the Sword of St. Peter and what that represents. Great book, St. Bernard on Consideration. I'm Ted Shoebat, and again, this is a message you will not hear in church. God bless.